I love being there, and I recognise lots of students love being there, but for students who live in
I'm just sorry to
levels
overlook
of
that.
stress.
Obviously, he didn't appreciate
Why
it,
are you-
so you really lost 5 minutes of it.
Oh no, don't worry about it, because there's so
I
much
just
to
go
that.
back to what I
People
know
will
Yeah,
take
and I
a
just
long
wonder to what
time
extent that's
to
the
walk
reason
to
for them going, no,
various
I
places.
can't.
Yes, I think 5 minutes is what's happening.
Yeah.
That's just in terms of the...
No, don't worry about it, because there's so much to think about. Just that.
But if you want to start off, see,
Yeah,
well, feel free.
I'll
Sorry, feel
just
free.
give a couple more minutes, I think.
Yeah,
No,
you
but
have
I-
to be safe in that age.
I think what fascinates me about that speech is still, I think we still have that propensity to think in terms of progress in a linear
Yeah.
model. So we're talking about going through threshold from one point to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. That kind of model doesn't seem to accommodate the multi-directional model. So we could go off something else rather than following the straightforward linear process. So sometimes we might make a U-turn to revisit something else that we came across in the past, instead of in the idea of moving along the line. I think I still have a problem with that kind of very straightforward model. But I'm sure overall we are still talking about progressing, I think, moving from one concept to the next. I still can't square that.
You did talk about coming back and revisiting and reconstitution and reframing, didn't you?
Yes.
That looping.
Epstein.
Yeah.
And there was so much at the end, unfortunately, because it was so
Yeah.
intense in the last 5. I felt really
Yes.
felt.
I just want to
wish I had
start
another
back
half an hour.
Yes, yes. Well, I think the starting point.
Starting with a threshold concept.
The starting point is definitely right.
Fascinating.
Coming back to Tom's introduction as the teacher voice, I think that's why we are all here. I think that's the sort of set the notion really going in the first place, that the desire to find a voice for ourselves, and that kind of impetus that's been driving the teacher need, research aids, and so on and so forward in the past at least couple of years, I think, and it's grown from strength to strength. Anyway, I think David invited me, I haven't spoken to him yet, kindly invited me to talk about my experience of trying to campaign for open access for teachers. I think it's talking about learning from the higher education sector, and then also vice versa from the schools. It does require access to material. I think without that access, it's very difficult for school teachers to actually do all those fascinating things that we've been sort of encouraged to do. I think that's fundamental, really. So I started a campaign, if you can call it that. In other words, a petition back in 2014, I think. And then up to last month, we've collected about 726 signatures. And then they've come from all over the world. And there are a few sort of typical comments left by those people who have signed. For example, I have been a teacher for 30 years, and yet for most of the time I have had to struggle to follow advancing my discipline and to gain access to research. And then another comment is, as a teacher researcher, invested in whole school improvement, academic research, that's rigor too. So the list goes on. So it is clear to me that there's a demand for teachers to gain access to the latest research material. And the trouble is, it's not all that easy. Even though democracy is slowly, in inverted commas, sort of coming through by the various holes on the internet. For example, Google Scholar, you can get a glimpse into certain articles made available as video files. So that helps to a large extent. And also, university alumni, they could access research material through just their membership status. So they could get, for example, through JSTOR. But otherwise, for busy classroom teachers, it's virtually impossible to invest extra time on top of planning and meeting and so on and so forth to actually look around for material. What would be an ideal model would be the Scottish way, the Scottish model about all teachers affiliated members, they have the direct access to research material. Or the Irish model, Irish teachers equally can access research material, but not in England and Wales, not just yet. In terms of policies, it's very difficult to sort of make changes quite quickly. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, and then that's why I'm here. So that's a sort of a quick update. So obviously it's not just a UK situation. Frank here is kindly to join me this morning to talk about the Dutch experience. So we've got responses from 7 countries, from South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. So it's actually a global kind of situation. So there's a unifying cry here from the teachers that they need access to research. And then, of course, it's also coming across all phases, from early years all the way to even further higher education as well. Higher education, yes, there is more about the endorsement that they fully support. And then representing diverse roles from classroom assistant to people on the leadership team, and so on and so forth. Then, and of course, from different all the subject areas too. So that's just a quick update. And that's the just a screenshot of the petition website, and people are still continuing to sign. So that's the last time that's back in, I think, last year. Right, so how did it all start? I think it's coming back to my experience as taking on the master's degree. Straight after, well, in the middle of trying to hold down the full-time job. And then it's by no means an easy task. Nevertheless, it's probably the one single most transformative experience that I've had in my life, I think. Straight away, this is what I discovered later. This is much, much later. When I started my MEd at Cambridge, when I joined the course without very much knowledge in terms of education theory. So I remember vividly when I went for my interview, and then my later on supervisor asked, so have you done any education theory before in your training? I said, no, none at all. I remember having to write 3 essays on, first one's teaching and learning, second one behavior management, and third one I can't remember exactly now. But I can't really claim that as kind of systematic learning. So I said no, and she said, then we'll have a lot of fun then. So I thought that's quite encouraging. But later on, when I read even sort of more into the idea of a teacher as a researcher, that's my main area, I began to explore a bit more, and then I came across Paulo Freire's concept of praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. And then that echoes nicely with this morning's session 1. I think it's not just about the students going through the transformational stages, the portals or liminality and so on and so forth, the transformative state. For teachers, it's equally the same. I think teachers experience that kind of uncertainty and intimidating or sometimes disconcerting stages throughout their careers as well. Not just through the teaching the subjects, but also performing all the other extra duties too. So we keep thinking about our identity. So are we just teachers of the subjects, or are we more than that? And then that's the one thought that kept me going through my research. I'm trying desperately to find sort of pinpoint my identity as a teacher, as an English teacher. Is it more than just a teacher? So I think when I started, I'd like to think I was more than just a teacher, more than just a subject teacher. I'm something else. And then that seemed to chime with what Freire and Kincheloe are talking about. And then for Kincheloe, that idea of teachers are more than just classroom teachers. They have greater roles to play. Later on, we'll come across Fulham's concept of agents, teachers as agents of change. As far as Kincheloe is concerned, this critical pedagogy is a way of living. You live it. So it doesn't just happen in the classroom or within the schools. is in our everyday life. And then I think the internet is a perfect vehicle for many teachers. I'm not saying that the majority, because there's still a small minority, I think, of teachers who are constantly active on Twitter. Nevertheless, it reflects that kind of desire for teachers to constantly talk about their profession, and then it becomes a way of living. And it's not just about sort of talking about it, but also acting on it. And I'll try to sort of group my reasons into three main sort of imperatives. Why do we need access to research material? What's the point? So first of all, I identified as a theoretical imperative. That's coming back to the idea of critical pedagogy. And secondly is professionals. This is not the updated one, so do forgive the grammatical errors here. But I think that's a perfect example of learning in progress. So professional imperative as well, and that's sort of meeting the demands in our everyday job. And practically, I think there's a need too. So there are a few key concepts that drive forward the idea of critical pedagogy, the need to gain access to research. So, for example, back in the 80s, the key concept would be a reflective practitioner. I think that idea is still pretty much encouraged in teacher training now. I remember when I started my GTP training, we had to write reflective logs. I don't know if it's still the case.
That's a trainee that I'm working with right now who she writes a reflective log, and she said to me, I don't really know why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Her take on it was this is not important.
That's precisely my idea.
Who cares what I think about it or how I feel? That's irrelevant with her sort of position. I sort of talked to her a bit about why.
I think when it becomes ritualised, and then that's where the problem lies, I think. Blogging is a good way to transform the kind of ritualised performance into something a bit more personal and meaningful. I think blogging, that's what I would encourage my colleagues to do as well, rather than just writing it because I have to fill that folder with all my reflective logs, but make it available to a wider audience. I think that will probably give them a bit more impetus to do so. But yes, it's been talked about for a long time. We know that for so many years, but a lot of people still see it as a kind of chore to perform rather than a purposeful activity. Teaching as a reflective practice, again, is all about reflection. Reflection places an emphasis on learning through questioning and investigation to lead a development of understanding. So it's the concept just continues along the lines of learning through reflection. And then obviously, if we look at the last bullet point, it obviously involves experiments as well. So construction of professional knowledge is key. And then that's why I think for many teachers we do need the access to research material. So that's just bouncing off each other's ideas. I skipped one. No, this is professional. So making a difference underscores our moral purpose. And of course, Fulham talked about that in 1993. That we have our moral purpose and change agentry are inextricably linked. So through our teaching, hopefully, we can bring about changes. And then the last slide would be about making changes, however small it is, even though we might feel that it's just within our own kind of domain, within ourselves, in terms of reconceptualizing our own identity. Are we more than just a classroom teacher, or are we just teachers, nothing else? And then on that note, I remember the first kind of practice survey I conducted within my own school, what makes a good teacher? And overwhelmingly, the responses pointed to subject knowledge. So the implication is, to be a good teacher, you have to know your stuff, and then that's the underlying kind of message. And then again, yes, even though that's the overwhelming result, but I still thought that there must be more than that. The fact that most people identify subject knowledge as the underlying, the one single most important characteristic in a good teacher, that somehow unsettled me as well. Does it mean that?
Sorry, was that survey with teachers or with students?
Teachers?
Yeah. Did you do a similar one with students to see if there was a difference of opinion?
For the students, I used somebody else's survey to identify. I think I've got screenshots somewhere else. They are very different criteria. For example, good humour, relating to taking interest in you, and so on. So it's very different to what teachers think as good teachers. So it's really interesting to see the comparison. But as far as my colleagues are concerned, it's subject knowledge. It could be several things. First of all, school ethos, maybe type of school. If it's a sort of highly academic school, that probably explains to a certain extent. In other words, it could also be argued that it's the success of certain kind of teacher training discourse. You are all trained to be your subject experts. That's the fundamental requirement. And then that makes you a good teacher to be able to stand in front of the classroom to deliver the lessons. But we all know subject knowledge alone is not going to make you a highly effective teacher. So there must be more than that. And it also brings us to the next question about, is it really what education is all about? Just imparting knowledge and skills. There must be more than that. And David Hargreaves sort of tried to map out a different kind of mode of professional identity in terms of teacher as knowledge creator. First of all, is the through University Centre for Knowledge, and then mode 2 is a partnership through knowledge production, so the collaboration between higher education and schools. And then mode 3, I think this is what is happening now, and it's still evolving. Research leads in schools. We see that kind of, I don't know whether or not there's a figure to suggest how many research leads there are in UK schools, or at least in England and Wales, but certainly it was pretty much unheard of only a few years back. I think I only became aware of the research leads probably after sort of getting involved on Twitter with Tom, and also reading other people's tweets about these new roles. For example, Carl's role at school as a research lead, and so on and so forth. In my own school, we have somebody who's responsible for research, and then we do have bursaries to enable teachers to conduct research projects. But it's very kind of localized, it's very kind of confined just within the school area, not as much as sort of taking on a greater role of communicating with other practitioners, other research leads, and then talk about research in general or their wider implications for education. But anyway, coming back to the idea of sort of going through different thresholds to name and rename, I think that underlines that kind of idea of identity. And then, are we looking at a new professionalism that would put more emphasis on teacher as researcher? Not in the sense that it's probably popularly understood as academic research, that you go through a certain really rigid process to conduct research. And then I think it's more about looking more closely into our everyday practice. And then that would be my next sort of quick topic about self-study, research methodology. That is not totally popular or common in this country yet, but that's something I adopted in my own MA research. But before we do that, I'm just wondering whether Frank would say something about their Dutch experience.
Sure. Well, thank you. I think you eloquently described all the background, I think, of this endeavor. For me, I'm on Twitter for a while, and I read about the petition that Vincent started, I think last year, August 2013, August or so, in the beginning of September. I even remember it because I was coming from a flight from the US I had to go to Portugal, and I had a delay on Heathrow, and I missed my flight, and I was in a kind of in-between space in Gatwick at one of the hotels, so this was my threshold at that point. I read this tweet, and it resonated with me. I've been a teacher, I'm a researcher now. I think I have both identities in me, sometimes arguing. And I read this tweet, and it really resonated with the things that I believe and I experience, both as a teacher and as a researcher. And I'm even studying the topic of like how teachers develop research in practice-oriented research, how they share it with colleagues, how they use it in schools. So I heard a lot of stories that actually in which the access of research was one of the big issues. And this tweet for me was, I think in a way, you know the example of the butterfly with the flap, and that causes the big storm at the other side of the world. This tweet I think was similar, but it was only across the North Sea then, because it created a kind of storm in Holland.
I'm extremely flattered.
It was a good flap. On the wing. So, no, what I said was, well, I can say, well, this is something I agree with. I signed the petition and that's it. And I even broadcasted it a bit in Holland, and I got a lot of response in Holland from teachers who said immediately, well, we should sign this as well. Then I thought, like, well, then we should take action also. So I said, what the heck? Also, e-petition, same like Vincent, inspired by Vincent. And the signatures came in quite quickly. A lot, of course, from teachers. But not only from teachers, and that was a pleasant surprise, but also from the director of the General Teaching Council in Holland, from some of the leading persons in Education Council, from all kind of places. And we're now about at the same place, almost 800 signatures, but from a diversity of people. And it was also pleasant to see that our Ministry of Education, our Secretary of State, takes a stance in open access. They're fighting now Elsevier, one of the biggest publishers, and they want them to, well, create open access, and I think that's good. But still there is no open access to teachers. So, in a way, somewhere I was upset about it. I think it is just unfair, because all the research is already paid for by society. And society invests in this type of research, educational research, because it can contribute to our students, to our teachers, to society. And now, as a teacher, if you want to use it, you have to pay again. You pay like $30, $40 for every time that you want to access such a journal. So it's very unfair. It's also unethical, I discovered. I found that in the UN, the human rights, so the Declaration for the Human Rights, there is a section which says that everybody in society should benefit from the advances in scientific knowledge. Keeping people away from that is unethical. So, and that's what we're doing with teachers. And also with the students, of course. We're keeping them away from the advances in scientific knowledge. But above all, it's very unwise, because it's like you're hiding one of the important tools of a teacher. It's like you're hiding the carpenter's hammer and say, well, you can hire it for a moment, you have to pay, but we want you to build a great house, beautiful evidence-based house. So it got me a little bit upset, and I think this is what this discourse took place in Holland, and many people agreed. And I think also the Secretary of State of Education, who also is of course on Twitter in a way, is also a little bit uncomfortable with the situation. So we're actually now trying to convince them, and it is planned now, that we're going to offer the petition at the next Research Act in Amsterdam. So that's by the end of January. So that is the plan, and hopefully he will come, he will dare to come to the lion's den of all those teachers. But yes, and hopefully that will send a message to the Ministry of Education. I hope something similar will happen here, and hopefully, like this is a kind of spin-off, this is a kind of a storm in Holland, hopefully there will be other people running petitions in other countries, because this will increase the voice of teachers and researchers, I have to say, that think this is just not good practice. So yeah.
I think it's an excellent analogy about carpenters building a great house, mansion, but you are only allowed to hire the tools. You can't keep them. You can't think about sort of how to best use those tools, but every time you need to use it, you have to hire it from us. So I think that's an excellent analogy I had to borrow. I'm just looking at the time. We have about 10 minutes for me to sort of briefly introduce self-study as a kind of viable alternative to educational research. And I'm quite happy to, well, I quite like to sort of have 5 minutes, because it's a very small audience. I think it's more probably conducive to good dialogue, where we can just talk to each other rather than me standing here.
It's a boutique audience.
It's a very critical audience. Yes, I think in my recent reading, I kept stumbling across research or sociologists back in the 60s, 50s and 60s. I think they somehow, over half a century, again, I begin to hear their voice again, and then their ideas resonate with sort of many of my questions at the moment. And then this is, through my research, I came across an article I will introduce later on. And there's a quote from Mills: "Every man is his own methodologist." On surface, it's a really straightforward kind of declarative sentence, nothing more than that. But the key word here is, if we can see beyond the gender-specific language in the subject, and then concentrate on being methodologist, I think that word itself encapsulates the multitude of identities within teachers themselves. They are not just pedagogues. They are also researchers. They are also in themselves methodologists. They are the living, breathing, acting, performing methodologists. And through all those kind of activities in everyday life, they can learn an awful lot if they could sit down and think about and reflect, and in some ways organize their own reflections and investigations. There will be some really highly constructive kind of discourse coming out of it, and hopefully through which we can then contribute to the wider kind of professional knowledge within the education sector. So that's the sort of our starting point here. As you can see, if you've used this kind of design straight from, I think it's Keynotes, you will see that bridge. And then 2 reasons why it's still there. 1, I was hard pressed for time. I didn't really have time to think of any other, to start for other images to replace that one. Secondly, I thought that's quite an apt image to incorporate in this idea of self-study, right? Going along a process in terms of finding out the best way forward. I think so. That's why I decided to keep that image still. So the topic is Introduction to Self-Study. What it's all about, how the teachers can best use that kind of research methodology. The starting point, again, coming back to Ray's keynote speech, is the collaboration between higher education and schools. And then, like all wonderful things, this also comes from America. The starting point is a group of higher education teacher educators, teacher training sort of lecturers working at universities. They decided to reflect and think about their own practice. How do they train teachers to be effective professionals? So the initial name is as a step. It sounds awfully like a popular group or Eurovision kind of group, as a step. But it's short for self-study of teacher education practices. And then that's set up back in 1992. And not long after that, 2 key events marked this entrance to the serious academia or academic world. One is the publication of the International Handbook of Self-Study. There's a free PDF file of several hundred pages of that handbook that I put the link in one of my blog posts on my blog page as well. So we can have a quick look at it later on. But there's several hundred, if I remember correctly, over 700 pages. And there's a collection of research papers based on self-study, right from the beginning of introduction to self-study to subject-specific case studies of practitioners using self-study to investigate their own practice. So it's a bulky book, but it's available on the internet as a PDF file. And the second key event is the publication of the journal itself. So I think that speaks volume in terms of how seriously it's being taken by professionals. And then self-study is characterized by educators' reflective study of their own practice, but at that stage it's mainly university teacher educators. So the flexibility of it, that's really the key kind of attraction to many school classroom teachers. It's flexible. Almost everybody could embark on, to a certain degree, their own self-study, providing that we know how to go about it and how to maximize the kind of validity. Or in self-studies, in the case of self-study, it's more kind of relatability. How do other teachers or professionals can relate to your own experience? I think that's the biggest attraction. It's not so much about making a grand kind of theory. It's not so much about theory-making research. It's more about research of relatability. And then that comes back to the whole idea of teacher voice. So nevertheless, it incorporates formal methodologies such as action research that is very popular within schools. And ultimately, we try to drive up. Sorry about the jargon, it's terrible. I'm using it as well. I've been resisting using driving up for years, and I'm using it twice already. Try to improve our own practice. Still, that's education jargon. Such as action research, case study, or ethnography. I think ethnography gives self-study awful lot of credibility there because it's all about being in it and speaking from that circumstance, from that situation. That gives teacher voice this authenticity and credibility. After all, teachers, we are very aware of the situation when policymakers make decisions on our behalf, and we all know fully well that they have probably very little everyday experience in the classroom. So that probably gives self-study the biggest kind of attraction. Fundamentally, self-study is driven by the educator's desire to improve their own practice. So that's the sort of background of self-study. And what is it then? Two academics, and they have come across trying to validate the approach as a kind of viable option. And then they published a paper, a short article called I have the article at the back as reference, but in that article they sort of try to highlight, define self-study. It is a study of one's self, one's actions, one's ideas, as well as the not self. So it's, in part, is responding to popular criticism of self-study as being narcissistic. It's all about yourself. Big deal. Your story is probably not going to be everybody else's case. So I think it's the last one, the not the self, trying to make it a bit more kind of, what's the word for it? Valid for other people as well, not just very self-centered. And second one, self-study is context-specific and dependent. It is therefore autobiographical, historical, cultural, and political. And as the paper progresses, we can see that the writers are trying to make it even more, have more sort of wider implications. They're trying to make it look and trying to make it in itself more kind of rigorous, ambitious kind of project. It goes beyond the self. It's per se. So autobiographical and political cultural, and I think that's something that we can link to our own experience as well. Now, lived experience is the foundation of self-study. It has to come from our own experience. Otherwise, it's like Hermann Hesse. I remember his famous comment about fictional writing. When he was asked about, do you always make up your own stories in your novels? And then I think what his response was that in one way or another, they were all lived experience, either through myself or other people. So nothing is totally imaginative. But anyway, that pretty much is the case of self-study. And with this holistic approach, self-study also involves a thoughtful look at texts read, experience had, people known, and ideas considered. Now, this marks the fundamental difference between self-study as a kind of alternative to other more formal approach, simply because it considers data types, a wide-ranging data types, from very specific kind of survey, questionnaire type data to everyday experience. They would also consider pictorial data, for example, kinetic data for interaction, data of interaction. So it's a very kind of holistic approach to research, and then that makes it very uncomfortable reading for more formally trained researchers who probably do not necessarily view those as kind of subjective. It's too subjective. It's just not objective enough for them. But anyway, that's the one of the attractions of study. And the attempt is to investigate for their own connotation. Sorry, that's just another error there. And relationship with the practice. To study a practice is simultaneously to study self, and study the self in relation to other. So that's from another article. The reference is also at the end. Now, when does it actually become serious research? And then we have to go back to Mill's concept of sociological research. Key idea here is that, in the second bullet point there, methods must not prescribe problems. No, the problems must prescribe methods. In other words, we have to identify the problems and find the best methods to try to find solutions, in other words. And then this is sort of a quick list of guidelines to make self-study a more serious kind of research. And then the first 9 guidelines are more about using autobiography, using narrative, for example, diaries, reflective logs, material like that as data. So there are 9 guidelines here. For example, it has to ring true and enable connection. Promote insighted interpretation. Promote history forthrightly, and the author must take an honest stand. So a lot of emphasis on honesty here. So autobiography is not fictional. It has to be true kind of experience, or as true as it can be. We all know how unreliable, sometimes reflective writing can be. Any narrative contains certain element of fictional elements in it. So we have to be aware of that, trying to be as honest as we can be. Number 5 is authentic voice. This is necessary but not sufficient condition. It has to be more than that. And improve the learning situation not only for the self but for the other. And then the last few are more about using emails and correspondence. So we can see that how they sort of consider wide-ranging data types, including now people begin to use Twitter responses as well. So that's a warning a mental note to ourselves: be careful with what we say on Twitter. You don't know when they are going to be cited by other people as their research data. So, provide the reader with an inside look at participants' thinking and feeling. So these are all sort of more correspondence-based. Just after I've amended all the errors, I'll put a copy on the Research Ed website as well, so together with the Access. I think I'll probably put the Access one on. And the final one, 14, is worth noting actually, is effective correspondence and self-study contain complication or tension. In other words, not just reporting good points, like Tom said, not just going to sessions that people we agree with, but also kind of counterpoints, different voices as well. But as far as Feldman is concerned, those 14 guidelines are good ideas, but we can make it more valid by doing those 4 things. For example, a clear and detailed description of how we collect data and to make explicit what counts as data. We know as busy teachers, if we look into our everyday practice, what kind of data types that we can use. Maybe sort of in-school meeting minutes, because this formal situation, so that would command a greater kind of authority in terms of data type. People are more likely to believe in that and then probably take them seriously as well. A clear and detailed description of how we construct a presentation from our data. Again, we have to explain really clearly how we arrive at certain assertions based on those data. And extend triangulation beyond multiple sources of data to include explorations of multiple ways to represent the same self-study. I think that's key. In my own research, I try to do that, try to just increase the authority of the research by triangulation, introducing different data types of the same event. For example, how students consider as a good teacher. So trying to use triangulation to make it more authoritative. And number 4 is provide evidence of the value of the changes. So these, hopefully, doing those 4 things would make our self-study a bit more kind of convincing. And then I put together a few sort of bullet points to help teachers, busy classroom teachers, to conduct their own self-study. And it's made, I've also put it on my blog page as well. Is it 5.2 we've had? Yes, it is now, yes. So, I think, first of all, is sort of be sensitive to our surroundings, our everyday life, and identify and notice a problem, and then start thinking about forming some kind of hunch. What's causing it? What's causing the tension? And then, how can I find out more about it? Do I just want to find out, or do I want to find a solution? And then that will determine what kind of methodology we are going to use next. And then that would also inform our methods. How are we going to collect data and so on and so forth. So, about 7 sort of bullet points. But I think fundamentally it is necessary really to check there's an research policy in the school. It's to do with ethical dimension of research. Every school should have a research policy or ethical policy at least. For example, the use of students' data, photograph, any information concerning young people, and then safeguarding kind of policy will probably in part answer that, but preferably ethical policy, and then that would make it a lot easier for teachers to conduct research. So if it involves videoing or taking photos of classroom action, there will be students, depending on the school and context, there will be students who cannot be identified photographically, or naming, or whatever. So all those basic kind of requirements that teachers need to be aware of before they actually start researching, otherwise they will be into serious trouble. And then you can have a look on my blog page. So I'm trying to cram into presentations in one slot. I hope that made some sense.
Thank you.
Yes, Tom.
A quick question. Chris, that was excellent. Thank you. And engrossing as always. Cost implications. When I was up doing research at Scotland, I spoke to some people from the University of Glasgow and I said to them, how on earth do you manage this? Doesn't it cost a fortune? Or does it cost a fortune? And they said it costs Scottish Government about £50,000. It's a drop in the ocean.
Yes, yes, I've had a similar.
Are we talking the same kind of scales for the UK?
I think.
Do you have figures?
somebody times 10, so quoting £300,000 for
Yes, Sam
England and
Freeman
Wales.
looked into
Was it
it,
Sam
didn't
that
he?
did it?
Sam, yes,
It's
Sam-
like
Sam
300 or
did it.
350,000
Yes.
I think we need to shake a few trees.
It's
great
a
idea.
small drop in the ocean.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's really a small drop in the ocean.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
think about the national investment in technology, in education.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Billions.
And also look at the ways in which information access has been so democratised
Mm.
in the past 5. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better. And we share like this, for example. If we could just access that ocean, that would be a tremendous
Yes.
catalyst, surely. Yeah, I
Yes,
agree.
and of course, some people rightly argue that not every teacher has the time to read an awful lot of papers. They need some kind of summary and so on.
Yeah.
It's a perfectly valid point, but I don't see that as a condition as such. It's a consideration, but it's not. It's not conditioned. Let the teachers decide.
Yeah, and if there's other teachers looking at it, somebody will.
Yes.
Somebody will summarise it for us.
Yes. So
That's one of the discussion points also in Holland, that a lot of people said, well, we can give open access to teachers, but they cannot access it because they don't understand the language, they're not interested, they don't have time.
this is where I'm going to put my foot down. I really resent the idea of gatekeeping. I really resent
This is an
that.
insult, and I think I compared it like, what you're saying actually is like, you have a dealer with shiny cars, and you can look through the window, and that's it. As a teacher, you cannot drive the car, so why bothering in getting your driver's license? Why bothering in becoming research literate if you cannot access it, if you cannot drive the thing? So I think it's a kind of fundamental thing, and in a way it is also a kind of, you could say, metaphor for how teachers are excluded from research. If it already is on such a basic level, I think you should shake a couple of trees, because it's not a lot of money, and it's a huge game. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're very kind. You're very gracious.